Just a few words on a phone screen, but it was enough to lock him away forever. Chris Watts sat alone in a small interview room, his hands folded, his face calm, too calm. He told police the same story again and again. His wife had taken their children and left. No fight, no struggle, no problem. But on a phone miles away, a message still existed. A message Chris believed was gone. And that message was about to destroy everything. Police leaned forward as they looked at the screen. The timestamp didn't match his story, the words didn't match his tone, and the person he sent it to should not have existed at all. The room felt smaller, the air felt heavy. Chris didn't know it yet, but the perfect crime was already over, and it all began with one text. What police discovered next would shock the entire country. But to understand how that single message ended a life of freedom, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the lies, back before the silence, back when everything still looked normal. Chris Watts was not the kind of man people feared. He was quiet, polite, helpful. Neighbors described him as calm and gentle, a man who waved, smiled, and kept to himself. He worked hard, he came home on time, he fixed things around the house. He was the type of man people trusted without thinking twice. Chris was married to Shanann Watts. She was energetic, loud, and full of life. She shared everything online: photos, videos, smiles, vacations. Their two young daughters were always laughing, always dressed neatly, always loved. From the outside, it looked like a perfect family. But behind the smiles, something was breaking. Chris felt trapped. He didn't talk much about his feelings. Instead, he kept them locked away. He didn't argue, he didn't shout. He stayed quiet and let things build inside him. Then, someone new entered his life. Her name was not supposed to matter, but it would become the most dangerous detail of all. Chris began an affair with a coworker. At first, it felt exciting, new, secret. He felt seen, he felt free. For the first time in years, he felt like someone truly noticed him. And he did what millions of people do when they fall into something they shouldn't. He texted. Late at night, early in the morning, messages filled with words he never sent his wife. Messages about dreams, plans, and a future that did not include his family. Those texts became his escape, and later, his downfall. As the affair grew stronger, Chris began to imagine a different life, a clean break, no arguments, no divorce, no explanation, just silence. He started thinking about how easy it would be if his old life simply disappeared. And that's when the idea took shape. The crime was planned quietly, carefully. No loud fights, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. Chris believed that if he stayed calm and followed his routine, no one would ever question him. He believed he could make it look natural. On the night it happened, there was no scream heard by neighbors, no broken windows, no blood outside, nothing that would make police rush in. By morning, Chris went to work as usual. He sent texts like nothing had happened. That was his mistake. Because while he was careful in the real world, he was careless in the digital one. Shanann's friend noticed something was wrong almost immediately. Shanann wasn't answering calls. She wasn't replying to texts. That was not normal. Police were called quickly. Chris stood in front of cameras asking for his family to come home. His voice shook just enough to sound real. His words were perfect. His face looked worried. But police don't just listen to words. They looked at data. Phones were collected, messages were reviewed, timelines were built minute by minute. And then investigators noticed something strange. Chris had been texting someone else. A lot. At first, he tried to hide it. He said it didn't matter. He said it was just work talk. But police already knew better. They recovered deleted messages, and one of them stood out. A message sent just hours after the crime. A message that showed relief, planning, a future. A message that proved his mind was already somewhere else, and his family was not part of it. That text didn't just contradict his alibi, it destroyed it. Because a grieving husband does not talk about starting a new life hours after his family vanishes. The text showed motive, it showed timing, it showed truth. Chris began to sweat. His calm started to crack. Investigators pressed harder. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They let the evidence speak. And the text message spoke loudly. Bit by bit, the perfect image collapsed. Chris's story changed, then changed again. Finally, he broke. He confessed. The man who thought silence would protect him learned the truth too late. In the modern world, there is no perfect crime. Phones remember everything. Messages never truly disappear. And one small text message was all it took to lock him away forever. But what Chris confessed to next was even darker and far more disturbing than anyone expected. And when police discovered where he had hidden the bodies, even seasoned investigators struggled to speak. That moment changed everything. Chris Watts finally spoke. The room went silent when the words left his mouth. His voice was low, shaky, and uneven. He no longer looked calm. The mask he had worn so carefully was gone. "I did it," he said. Those two words hit the investigators like a heavy weight. For hours, Chris had denied everything. He cried, he blamed others, he changed his story again and again. But now, sitting under the bright lights, he admitted the truth. Or at least, part of it. Chris claimed that he had snapped. He said there was an argument. He said Shannon had hurt their children, and in a moment of rage, he killed her. He tried to paint himself as someone who lost control, someone pushed too far. But police didn't believe him. The story didn't match the evidence, the timeline didn't work, and the text messages, those messages, told a very different story. Investigators stayed calm. They didn't accuse him directly, they simply listened. They asked him to repeat details. They asked him to explain things he hadn't planned for. And slowly, his lies began to fall apart. Chris had believed that if he confessed to something smaller, something less shocking, he might control the damage. He thought he could still shape the story. He was wrong. Police already knew more than he realized. They knew about the affair. They knew about the plans. They knew about the future he was imagining with another woman. And most importantly, they knew the crime wasn't sudden. It was planned. When investigators pressed him again, Chris broke down completely. His shoulders shook. His face dropped into his hands. And then he told them what really happened. The truth was darker than anyone expected. Chris admitted that he had thought about it before that night. He had imagined his life without Shannon and the children. He had imagined freedom. He had imagined silence. On the night of the crime, Shannon came home late from a trip. The house was quiet. The children were asleep. Chris waited. There was no screaming, no loud fight, no neighbors heard anything. That was part of his plan.
After it was over, he didn't panic. He didn't run. He didn't call for help. Instead, he began cleaning. He changed his clothes. He wiped surfaces. He gathered his thoughts. He prepared for the next step. And then, before sunrise, he loaded his truck. This was the moment investigators focused on, because this was where the story became impossible to ignore. Chris drove to a remote worksite owned by his company. It was a place few people visited, a place he knew well, a place he believed would hide his secrets forever. But again, he forgot one thing: his phone. Cell phone data placed him exactly where he claimed he had never been. GPS signals followed his route. Timestamps matched his movements, and the text messages kept coming back into the conversation. While driving to dispose of the bodies, Chris was still communicating, still thinking about his new life, still acting as if nothing had happened. Investigators listened as he explained what he had done at the site. Some of them looked down at the table. Others stared at the wall. No one interrupted him. When he finished, the room felt heavy. Police didn't celebrate. They didn't raise their voices. They simply stood up and told him they were going to verify everything. And that's when the full weight of reality hit him. Because once police arrived at the site, they found exactly what Chris described. There was no mistake. The truth was undeniable. The case that started with a missing family was now a confirmed murder investigation, and the evidence was overwhelming. Chris Watts was arrested. News spread fast, faster than anyone expected. People who had watched his television interviews felt sick. People who had defended him online went silent. The image of the calm, worried husband was replaced with something terrifying. A man who smiled while lying. A man who texted about a future while destroying his past. As the case moved forward, prosecutors built their argument carefully. They didn't rely on emotion alone. They relied on facts. Phone records, location data, deleted messages, witness statements, and that single text message kept returning as a key moment. It showed his state of mind. It showed intent. It showed that the crime was not an accident or a sudden loss of control. It was a choice. Chris eventually pleaded guilty. There was no trial, no long courtroom drama. He knew the evidence would crush him. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, locked away forever. But even after the sentencing, the story didn't end. People asked the same question again and again. How could someone plan something so carefully and still fail? The answer was simple. Technology remembers. No matter how quiet you are, no matter how calm you appear, no matter how perfect your story sounds.
Phones record your life. Texts reveal your thoughts. And one message sent at the wrong time can expose everything. But there was still one final twist, something investigators discovered later that made this case even chilling. Something about Chris's behavior after the arrest that raised new questions. Questions that still haunt people today. Chris Watts was already locked behind steel doors when investigators realized the story still wasn't finished. The prison cell was small, gray walls, a thin bed, a place meant for quiet and regret. For most people, this would be the end of the story, a confession, a sentence, a man locked away forever. But Chris didn't stop talking, and what he said next disturbed even the people who thought they had heard it all. Months after his sentencing, investigators received a request from Chris. He wanted to talk again. He said he wanted to tell the full truth. That alone raised alarms, because people who have nothing left to lose don't usually change their stories, unless there is something darker still hidden. When agents sat across from him in the prison interview room, Chris looked different, thinner, quieter, but strangely relaxed, like a man who had finally accepted his place. He began to speak, and this time, he didn't blame anyone else. He admitted that his earlier confession was incomplete. He admitted that he had lied even when he thought the case was over. What he described next was chilling. Chris explained that the crime was not a sudden moment of anger. It was not a reaction. It was not an accident. He had thought about it for weeks. He described lying in bed next to his wife, knowing what he planned to do. He described going through daily routines while imagining life without his family. And then he said something that made the room go cold. He said he knew, even before that night, there was no turning back. Investigators listened carefully. They didn't interrupt. They knew every word mattered. Chris talked about his emotions, or the lack thereof. He said he felt empty, not angry, calm, not scared. He said he believed that once it was over, everything would be easier. But the most disturbing part came when he talked about after. After the crime, after the lies, after the interviews. Chris admitted that while police were searching for his family, he was still thinking about his future, still texting, still planning. That single text message, the one that helped expose him, wasn't a mistake to him at the time. It was a priority. That realization shocked investigators more than the crime itself, because it showed something terrifying. Chris wasn't careless. He simply didn't think the rules applied to him. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, smarter than police, smarter than technology, smarter than the truth. And that belief cost him everything. As investigators reviewed the case again, they noticed something that hadn't stood out before. Chris's phone activity didn't slow down after the crime, it increased. Messages, searches, notifications. His digital life told a clearer story than his words ever could. It showed a man who thought he could erase people from his life the same way he erased messages from his phone. Delete. Move on. Start fresh. But technology doesn't work that way. Even deleted messages leave traces. Timestamps remain. Location data connects the dots. The perfect crime had never been perfect at all. It was fragile, and one text message was enough to shatter it. As news of Chris's final confession became public, the reaction was intense. People felt sick, angry, confused. How could someone look so normal and hide something so dark? Experts weighed in. Psychologists studied his interviews. Investigators replayed his words again and again. One conclusion became clear. Chris Watts didn't fail because he made one small mistake. He failed because he underestimated reality. He underestimated how quickly people notice when something is wrong. He underestimated how much phones remember. And he underestimated the power of one honest timeline. That single text message contradicted everything he said. It showed where his mind was. It showed what he wanted. It showed that his family was already gone in his thoughts. That's why the case became so important. It wasn't just about one man. It was a warning. In a world filled with cameras, data, and digital footprints, silence is no longer empty. Every message tells a story. Every phone leaves a trail. And every lie has an expiration date. Chris Watts will never walk free again. He will never start the new life he imagined. He will never escape the message that exposed him. Locked away forever. But the questions remain. How many crimes have failed because of one small digital mistake? How many people believe they've erased the evidence when it's still waiting to be found? And how many perfect crimes are already falling apart right now because someone sent one message they shouldn't have? In the final chapter, we'll look at the moment Chris realized there was no escape left. The moment he understood that the text message would follow him for the rest of his life. And the final truth that even prison walls couldn't hide. Don't go anywhere.
The lesson of the case didn't end with the prison door closing. Long after Chris Watts disappeared from the news cycle, investigators kept using his story as a warning. Not because it was rare, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. In quiet classrooms and training rooms, officers talked about the same mistake again and again. They talked about the phone, about the message, about how people forget that their lives are written down every day, without ink, without paper. Chris had believed that if he stayed calm, he could control the story. He believed that silence would protect him, that deleting messages meant erasing the past. But the truth was already saved somewhere else, in backups, in servers,
in timestamps that never forget. That single text message mattered because it showed who he was when he thought no one was watching. It showed his real thoughts, not the ones he practiced in front of cameras. It showed intent without anger, planning without panic. And that is why it followed him all the way to prison. Experts later said something chilling. If Chris had never sent that message, the case might have taken longer, much longer. Not because he was smarter, but because digital evidence often speaks before people do. The message spoke clearly. It said the crime was not an accident. It said the future mattered more than the present. It said the truth before his mouth ever did. Today, Chris lives a quiet life behind bars. No interviews, no spotlight, just days that blend together. Meals, counts, silence. The phone is gone, but the message remains. Families across the country still remember the case, not just for what happened, but for how easily a normal life collapsed. A house, a job, a routine, all undone by one decision, followed by one message. It's why the story still matters, because it isn't about one man. It's about a world where nothing truly disappears. Every text is a thought captured. Every call is a moment recorded. Every movement leaves a shadow. People still believe they can plan the perfect crime, that if they're careful enough, quiet enough, smart enough, they can disappear from the truth. But the truth has changed. It lives in data. It waits patiently, and it only needs one crack to break everything open. Chris Watts learned that too late. And somewhere, right now, someone else is typing a message they think doesn't matter. A message they believe will be forgotten. A message that could change everything. This story is over, but the warning isn't. Stay aware, stay careful, because the smallest detail can be the loudest confession. And once a message is sent, it never truly leaves.